Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
Roy Ransom Allen, Edward Matthew Amato, Louis Allen Ambrose, Herman E. Anders Jr., Dennis Richard Andrew, Carl Thomas Anthony, Bill Ashford Jr., Franklin D. Ashley II, Matthew David Atkins III, Robert Wagner Atwell, Juan Pascua Aviles, Robert Allen Batesel, Edgar Baker Jr., Norman L. Balance III, Michael Arlen Balzer, Louis Joseph Barbaria, Gary Joe Barnett, Charles Ricky Bartholomew, Larry Dean Barton, Thomas Lynn Bell, Terence John Bellomo, Richard Dennis Benedum, Richard C. Benisovich, Guy Raymond Benson, Alan Martin Bernstein, Daniel F. Betancourt Jr., Thomas Arnold Bird Jr., Russell Laverne Bishop, Patrick Lynn Blair, John Charles Blake, William George Blanchard, Kenneth Jean Blanton, Willie Edward Bolton, Scott Cannon Bocut, John Michael Bowers, Joseph George Bowman Jr., Robert Neil Bradley, James Dale Brewer, Robert Allen Breed, Robert Guy Brown, William Arthur Brown, Walter Tarver Bryant, Michael Rogers Calloway, David George Callis, William Henry Campbell, Robert Michael Cartwright, Ronald Brett Castle, Robert Edward Castle, Juan Pascual R. Castro, James Henry Cavici Jr., Joseph Champion, John Richard Chapman, Paul Claude Charvet, Calvin K. Chow, William Malcolm Church, Ronald Sanders Colson, Frank Ray Compton, Ronnie Edward Conacher, John Paul Crandall, Ronald Lee Krieger, Robert Allen Dalton, Robert Scott Davis, Alan Eunice Davis, Floyd Robert Davis,
Joe Eddie Demerson, William Lawrence Dent, Joseph John DeLandro, Timothy Easley, Jack Eaton, Michael Leroy Ebert, Johnny Lawrence Edwards, Richard Lee Inns, Thomas McClure Elliott, Walter Jean Mervyn Ellis, Alan Ladd Elmore, Charles Robert Emery, John Engadal, Tony Lee England Jr., Eddie Lee Ephraim, Joseph Martin Eustaquio, Jerry Lee Ewing, Joseph Barnett Furneaux, Tennis Crispian Farrell, Thomas Bernard Flood, Walter Henry Forbes III, John Henry Franklin, Ronald Clifford Franson, Donald Jerome Frizzell, Willard John Fries, Bobby Glenn Gady, Brian Francis Gibbons, Harry Hutchison Gibson, Martin L. Gillespie Jr., Marvin Edward Glassburn, Stephen Arthur Golsh, David Gonzalez, Charles Ray Goodwin, Otis Leon Gosnell, Jan Joseph Grabowski Jr., Barry Wade Graff, Willie Grant Jr., Clifford Newton Green, Charles Robert Greer, Thomas Jackson Grindstaff, John Thomas Godekunst, Jack Dennis Hanger, Gary Leon Hanlon, Gerald Arthur Hahn, Everett Eugene Harding, Terry L. Harper, John Oliver Harris, Larry Wayne Harvey, Jerry Pavey Hawkins, Roger Leo Henderson, Robert Lee Henderson, James Lynn Hink, Gilbert Hernandez Carrion, Manuel Herrera, David Edward Hirschbach, Peter Dean Hesford, Mickey William Hill, James Raymond Hintz, Ernest Lloyd Hertler, Daniel Jennings Holcomb, Leonard Donald Holder, Edward Eugene Holt, William Henry Holthoff, James Harvey Hobson,
Charles Ernest Hosking, Jr., Charles Edwin Huddle, Jr., Edward Monroe Hudgens, Errol Arthur Hughes, Mosa Childs Hundley, John Lewis Hunter, Benito Igarta, Jr., Kenneth Leo Johnner, Donald Ray Johnston, Larry William Jones, Lewis Henderson Jones, Thomas Edward Jones, Jr., Joe Richard Jordan, Robert Lee Castor, Robert Michael Kelly, Wesley Shepard Kerr, James Edward Kesselhan, James Michael King, Dennis Klein, Noah Morris Kraft, Albert Otto Krauser, Frank Anthony Krieger, Lynn Robin Kreutzer, George Leo Lakey, David Clyde Lancaster, Peter Swinnerton Larson, Herman Earl Lassiter, Virgil Madison Ledford, Henry C. Lee, Raymond Elton Layton, Earl Lloyd Lewis, Dale Dennis Lingle, James John Lister, Jerry Roy Long, Ricardo Lopez, Charles Robert Lovedahl, William Edward Lund, Vaclav Józef Magzulski, Rafael A. Madrigal Cordero, Jr., William Earl Mallory, Jr., John Perry Malloy, James Walter Manti, Billy J. Marling, Flor Marrero Baez, Alan Frederick Marshall, Stephen James Martin, Raymond Leroy Mason, Larry Maurice Mason, Earl Martin Matthews, Henry Robert Matthews, Johnny Murray Mayo, Charles Edward McGee, David Eugene McLemore, Miles Joseph McLaughlin, Philip Aaron McNinch, George Edward Menninger, Lester George Michaels, Louis Edward Milam, Frederick C. Miller III, Ted Douglas Mills, Thomas Francis Minogue, John Albert Mitchell, Freddie D. Mize, Joel William Mock,
Edgar Eugene Moody, Terry Patrick Moreau, Mitchell Thomas Morton, Larry Thomas Mulder, Joseph Bernard Mueller, Edward Jerry Muller, Thomas Joseph Murphy, Billy Dan Murphy, Michael Gary Murray, John Paul Nagy, Garland Andrew Newhouse, Thomas McNett Newman, Daniel James Newman, Jr., German Lee Nicholson, Samuel Ray Nixon, Robert Edward O'Brien, Robert Egmedio Ocampo, John William Odierno, Charles Francis Orlowski, Percy Edward Owens, James Ralph Pace, Larry Parker, Thomas Douglas Peterkin, David Bruce Peterson, John Francis Pizzullo, Richard Bruce Phillips, Robert Emmett Pearson, Robert Merritt Pinnell, Jr., Stephen Donald Pleasant, Lawrence Edward Pollock, Leonard Lee Preston, Jr., Terry Lee Quinn, Ronald Edward Rakunas, Billy Wayne Rapp, Charles Allen Ralston, Donald Bruce Reese, James Randolph Regnolds, Robert Harvey Renke, Ray Anthony Rhodes, Ferris Lee Richardson, Robert Stanley Richmond, Stanley Riffle, Robert Lucian Riggins, Jr., Miguel Angel Rivera, Wayne Leroy Roberts, Joseph Earl Robinson, David Clyde Rogers, Ronald James Romero, Jesse B. Rose, Roger Dwayne Roseberry, William Edwin Rowe, Gilbert Ruiz, Rodolfo Sanchez, Andres Santiago Martinez, Rene Anthony Santos, George Thomas Sargent, Jr., Larry Scott, John Fellows Skull, Jr., Thomas Martin Siklecki, Frederick William Seeput, William Warren Sherman, Walter Reuben Short, Walter Glenn Schultz, Claudius Augustus Small,
James Edward Smith, Robert Joe Smith, Albert Edward Smith, Jr., Andrew Richard Smith, Jr., Chris Anthony Souza, William Arthur Stacy, Jr., Keith Powell Stevenson, Carl Michael Steitley, Dale Lewis Stock, Dennis Bernard Stockwell, Chesley Alexander Story, Aubrey Eugene Stowers, Jr., Michael G. Sudborough, Buford Ellis Sumner, Richard David Swayze, Thomas Robert Talmadge, James Glenn Taylor, Clifford MacArthur Taylor, Algernon Paul Thomas, Daniel Thomas, Monte Vernon Thomas, Michael Kelly Thompson, Gerald Richard Thompson, Philip Bruce Thompson, John Mark Titterman, Daniel Tynda, Andre Barry Timms, Justin Glaston Turnbull, Hazel Calvin Turner, Thomas Wayne Underwood, John Juan Valero, Julius Joseph Valent, Jr., Kelly Patrick Vaughn, William Glenn Wade, James Alfred Walker, Jr., John Paul Wanto, Larry Lyman Warnock, Bruce Lamar Watkins, Stephen Len White, Stephen Jackson Welsh, Charles Franklin White, Ronnie Rudolph White, Thomas William Witten, Ronald Wayne William, Vincent Richard Williams, Billy Joe Williams, Harold Wendell Wilson, Carl Richard Wilson Jr., Theodore R. Woods Jr., Richard Henry Woodward.